Today's web class, we're going to pick up on the attachment histories. And my goal for today is I would like for all of us to, at least in one situation, be able to identify the cycle that we most likely get into when we're in conflict and attach that back to the experiences we've had as a child that probably drive the steps that we take when we are under distress or in conflict. This is Troy Faddis, Clinical Director for Legacy Outdoor Ventures.
Hi, this is Maddie Liebing. I'm the Clinical Director for Juniper Canyon Recovery Center for Women. My goal is to help identify that cycle, but to look at the emotions that go along with it. The secondary or reactive emotions, the deeper vulnerable emotions, and also looking at the unmet needs so that we can be able to identify why we get into these cycles and be able to identify the cycles themselves that we get into in our families. So just an introduction, we wanted to put up some information so that you have contact information for Troy and I. That's mine first, Dr. Maddie Liebing, and my emails, and also Troy's identifying information so that you can contact him too if you have questions or want more information.
You can find us at the websites, junipercanyonrecovery.com, legacyoutdooradventures.com, and our emails, Troy at Legacy Outdoor Adventures and Maddie at Legacy Outdoor Adventures. Or you can use the Juniper Canyon versions of our emails as well. So I wanted to review the attachment histories that we talked about last week. And one of the things that we talked about last week was the Dr. Woolley's questions that look at how we experienced our primary attachments with caregivers growing up, and were they available, and were they consistent in their availability, and when things were difficult, were they reassuring or soothing, or were they a lot of discipline and correcting, and do they feel uncertain at times? So I hope that you went through those questions and that was an experience, thinking about the answers to those, you had an experience of remembering what it felt like to have a safe place, a safe relationship in which to go out and explore the world, and how that shaped the way you dealt with things going forward. And that's what we want to talk about today, is how do we now experience things that, like relationships, when they are not easy, like when we're parenting our children and our young adult children. What are the ways that we get into interactions with them that may help or push the relationship further away?
Yeah, families often get caught in negative cycles of interaction, and that's just a repeating pattern of what people do, think, and feel in when you're under stress or in distress. And it just we end up just kind of continuing to cycle, and you'll find yourself, this is a very familiar process, and you go, wait a second, I'm in the same negative cycle with my young adult child that I've been in before, and it probably comes all the way through their teenage years, maybe even when they were younger. And so we're just going to try to identify some of those cycles. And so if you want to go to the next slide, we're just going to work our way through this worksheet. And I'm going to use myself as an example. As I've worked through, because I've worked through the worksheet myself. And so when my young adult, I'm thinking about a daughter that I have, and she is just bought a car, and because she's moved away from home, she's finished school and moved away from home. The insurance she couldn't go on our insurance, so she had to get her own insurance. So we helped her to purchase the car, and of course she's going to make the payments, and then she's going to pay for the insurance, but she had to actually get the insurance. And so I called her up a couple of days after she got the car and said, so have you got your insurance lined up? And she says, well, I haven't had time yet. I haven't got it set up yet. And of course, I kind of went on instantaneously ballistic and into into the cycle really quickly. So what I did, the way I reacted, and what I'd like to have us look at is the list of possible parent action behavior list. And these are different reactions that parents might have in a situation where a young adult child and I are not connecting, which is the case in this particular situation. I often react by, and in this list, the very first one actually fits me perfect. Insist on making my point even if I get pushy. That's kind of my response. But you can see there's a lot of different choices there. And maybe the way that you respond is not on that list. Maybe you can think of something else that seems to fit better. So in starting this process, we're just going to kind of work our way through step by step. And the first step is, my first reaction is that I insist on making my point even if I get pushy. And then the next question is, number 2, is my young adult child often reacts to me by, and there's when they're not connecting, their possible behavior lists. And I looked through that list, and what she did with me is she expressed her frustration with an attitude. And so that's like number 4 down there. So she started getting kind of, a little bit angry and a little bit frustrated, and started to push back a little bit in this process. And then question number 3 is, when my young adult reacts this way, I often feel, that's number 3. And then there's a parent's feeling list that we can look at in the handout. You want to jump over to that? Parents' feeling list. And I was struggling with this list because I couldn't really find one that is exactly what I was feeling. But I think the closest was that I was afraid. I was afraid that something was going to happen, and her, she was going to get in a car accident. And so I think of fear and being scared was my first reaction, that this was not okay, what she was doing, because of the ramifications and what could possibly happen, and what the consequences would be if she got in an accident before she had insurance. Mm-hmm. So then we run down to the next question, number 4. And when I react the way I do, I have to kind of guess what she might be feeling. And later we processed this, and so I found out what she was feeling, but I didn't know this at the time. So I was, but if I was to guess now, having talked to her afterwards, hers was angry, but it was mostly because she felt like I didn't trust her. And so it was anger because she felt, a lack of trust on my part.
At that middle column at the very bottom, it says small or insignificant.
Yeah, that would kind of fit. Yeah, like mom knows best, and she's not going to listen to me or let me, have say in this, or think that I can be able to truly adult in this situation. And I was questioning her adulting, so we were definitely in that cycle for sure.
Right. And I see there's unimportance, the 5th one down the first column too. I think that's the one you identified. Yeah, the hopeless. Yeah, hopeless, and what's the point? Mm-hmm. I'm sure she probably had some of that going on too. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so then the next question, number 5, is, when you're in this kind of a negative spiral, what do you say to yourself about your relationship with your young adult? And I was saying something like, she just isn't, if she would only listen, really, is what I was saying. That she's just not hearing what I'm trying to say. I can't seem to get through. I'm just bumping into emotion, and she's not listening to the reason and the fact that I'm right. She's not hearing my rightness, which obviously is not going to work very well. And then question number 6, I think, is the next slide. It didn't do the numbers. What do I imagine my young adult is saying to herself? And we have a list for that, is what I think I say to myself for the young adult list. So flip over to that list. One more. There you go. I'm not sure if hers is on there. As I look through this list, I think her main thing was that she just doesn't trust me.
and I'm tired of her not trusting me. I think that would be the main one for her. I'm not sure if any of these others kind of fit. I'm sure there was a little bit of I need to get out of here. I need to get out of this conversation because it's not going anywhere. I'm sure she had some of that going on too. And then the next question is, when you're in this kind of negative cycle, how do you think your family member sees you right at the moment? And in my case, it was that she probably saw that I was being demanding. She saw that I was being demanding and not understanding. So those things are on that list too. Well, not on the list, they're on the question itself. And then the last question in identifying the negative cycle is, can you give this negative cycle a name? And my name was that I gave this one is the frustration polka. Because I'm frustrated, she's frustrated, and we're just not making any progress at all.
So I hope that from that example, you can start to see the ways that our attachment styles can influence the types of repetitive conflict we tend to get into, where most of the time we'll take on a position where we're either the person that tends to pursue, which is, Maddie, I think what you were saying, you are more likely to do.
I was definitely pursuing.
Yeah, and maybe you can see, like, maybe it's because it's the role of being a parent, or maybe it's also from your own attachment history, the reasons why you tend to take on that role.
Yeah, I think it definitely as a parent, I think throughout my whole parenting of my children and now my adult children, I have a hard time not being the pursuer. Yeah, it is definitely, it's an overall style in the way that I operate as a parent, for sure.
Yeah. I was thinking about that because I think that there's probably some attachment histories that I have that I'm still trying to connect with in the moment, but I pursue too. And I pursue to a point. And then after that point, I think I can disconnect and then be the withdrawer in the relationship. And I was thinking about this example that I did as you were asking those questions. For my middle boy, he has type 1 diabetes. And this has been his first year out of the home and at college. He's down at Southern Utah University. And I was curious how he would manage his diabetes by himself. And I found myself, as you're asking these questions, so specifically, what were my my behaviors? And I hate to call it complaining or criticizing, but I'm sure that's what it was. But I found myself, asking him at the beginning of every phone call, "Hey, what's your blood sugars like? Are they in the 200s, the 300s, or higher? And if they have been, for how long? What have they looked like the last couple of days? He's on an insulin pump. So when was the last time you changed your site? He has to have 2 sites because he also has a continuous glucose monitor. So, ask him, like, how's your monitor? Is it working? Is it not working? If it's not working, when was the last time you tested? Did a finger prick instead of using the continued glucose monitor for reliability? And so I'm always asking him those type of questions. And then, sorry, this is the page I should have been on. Mm-hmm. Like you said, insisting on making my point, like this is important. Expressing my disapproval, like, oh my goodness, Tanner, your numbers have been that high for how long? And are you okay? And what type of symptoms are you feeling? And are you feeling sick? And making threats about consequences. Like, what happens if your blood sugar stays high for a really long period of time? Maybe that's why you're having a hard time with your homework or taking that test. So I found myself, or like this one, placating or having the talk. I bet Tanner could say, like, yes, Dad, I get it. anyhow, when we were talking about those you were going through those questions, I was thinking about my own responses to all of those in this example of Tanner managing. In fact, I can even be specific. One of the things that we really wanted to do is he was going to college was helping him start taking care of his own supplies. And so getting his prescription down to the local pharmacy and him getting his own insulin. And it seemed like, of course, to me, that we'd need new continued glucose monitor sites, and he'd let me know like the week after he ran out. And so trying to figure out how to get him new sites before or quickly. And so we'd get into the cycle. And so, you ask these questions where I can see Tanner trying to take his accountability for it because he knew it was important. At the same time, maybe withdrawing from the pursuit of me wanting to manage it from afar. And so that was part of this cycle that I find. If I filled this piece of paper in, where I can see my behaviors being questioning, micromanaging, maybe at times disapproving. And, I can imagine that Tanner's reaction, if he's over here, let me get my mouse, is being one of like perceiving my dad as not trusting me, or my dad is questioning me, or wondering if I think he can do it on his own. My reactive emotion is to probably be worried, to be scared, maybe at times even being frustrated and exasperated. And then Tanner's, I'm sure his reactive emotions were maybe even similar, to also be frustrated, to be maybe even shame or guilt or sadness. But I think that below that would be my vulnerable emotions. And, that's where I meant, like, I think sometimes my role as a pursuer, as a dad, comes from my role as a dad. Those vulnerable emotions of feeling like, am I doing it good enough? Am I setting him up for success? Am I not doing harm? My own shame, my own guilt of having done a good enough job to help him launch. And I'm sure like those vulnerable emotions are a big part of what drives all of the things above this, the reactive emotions, my perceptions, and my behavior. And there's a line through this eternity symbol, which represents that we're in this cycle, and the cycle can repeat. And if you notice, like, I can change. One of the things I think is important for us to point out when we're doing this approach is that we don't focus so much on the content. And in fact, the content can often be relevant and even distracting from helping us really make a change or find a solution. What really matters is the process that we're in. If we can understand the reason why we're in this process, like, why do I do this? Why do I pursue? Why do I criticize? And express the purposes behind it, the reactions I get will probably be different than the ones I normally can encounter. So understanding one's process with someone else is far more important than the content that we're stuck on.
Well, and I think an important part of that is that it's not about one person being the bad guy or another person being the bad guy. It's about the process being the bad guy. So sometimes we do the game find the bad guy, and it really is the process that is in reference to, a lot of times Sue Johnson and other people call this the demon dialogue. It's the demon dialogue that we want to look at and to understand and to get to the bottom of and be able to interrupt, as opposed to blaming someone. And I think we end up going to blame really quickly. And when we are, then we're definitely in that cycle, whether we're withdrawing and feeling like we can never do anything right, and the other person's never going to think we're valuable or care about us in the way that we want to be cared about, or if we're pursuing and feeling frustrated that the other person isn't hearing the things that we're trying to say and valuing, our interaction.
Yeah.
So it is, again, it's really about the process.
Yeah. You just talked about, like, if I cannot talk about my vulnerable emotions, what typically happens in my behavior is that not only do I criticize, but I probably start to blame, label, like, why do you do this? Are
Mhm.
you stupid? Do you not get it? What's your problem? I talk down to as a behavior, but I was thinking about an example I had the other day with one of my boys where I just expressed my vulnerable emotion. And I shared how it hurt, and my because I hurt when he would say something, my perception was that he didn't care about me. And when I expressed that vulnerable emotion, it changed the entire dynamic. And it's interesting. He went, "Oh, he really just went, really?" I said, "Yeah. Like, I when you say that, I think you don't care about me, and it says that my feeling is unimportant to you." He's like, "I had no idea." And it totally changed the dynamic we had the rest of the afternoon. And I think that's the value of working on things that are below this line and not just being focused on the things above the line. And that's actually one of the reasons why the line's there, is that although not entirely for everyone, for the most part, the things above the line are somewhat conscious. We know that they're there, and we can observe them. But a lot of times, these things below the line are unconscious. We may not even recognize or know them.
I think that's what happened with my daughter, is that we finished our conversation by text because we were both emotionally so charged. And so I texted her back and I said, I'm so sorry that I came across so pushy, because I was just experiencing a lot of anxiety and just feeling a lot of fear. And I recognized that I was being overcome by my fear and probably not being terribly rational in the process. And in the process, I undermined you, the efforts that you're making, and the fact that you are adulting and trying to do your best, and that you are capable of doing those kinds of things. And so I just apologized for my fear and my the anxiety that was underlying, was kind of my, I think, vulnerable emotion. Is just I was just terrified.
Mhm.
And of course, I think even deeper than that, just like Troy mentioned, there's always that fear of that I really screwed up. If I was a good parent, she would know how important it is to have insurance on her car, you know.
Yeah.
So it goes, a lot of times goes deeper into that. Am I okay? Did I do okay as a parent? Am I doing okay as a parent? Am I okay? Period. In my relationship with her. I think those get into those deeper things, and then that takes us into the next layer.
Okay, before you do that, Maddie, you just modeled
Go ahead.
one of the most important parts of this. So
Okay.
thank you. One of the things that I noticed, and I did it, but you modeled it the right way, is that when we're stuck in this, a lot of times we end up having a perception of only ourselves. We can only see us. And one of the hardest things to do is having a perception of the other person. And you just did that. You started talking about a perception of what your daughter was also experiencing, not just you.
It helps you to break the cycle.
Yeah. I not only focusing on the cycle as the problem and not each other, worrying about the process of the cycle and not the content, but then being able to see the other person, like really understand the other person's side of the cycle and not only focus on your own. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And then you can go on, like you're about to go to the deeper level, which is one of my favorite.
Yeah, and of course, the very bottom of this trash can of negative cycle is the unmet needs. it's a little bit hard. I don't know if we can make that image a little bit bigger when we're going through this, but if you look closely, you can see that's the bottom line is the unmet needs, the pieces that you're missing. And in my daughter's case, I think she was missing, her unmet needs was to have her feel that her mother has confidence in her ability to be an adult. And that was not being met by my fear. My unmet need was a reassurance that she understood the importance of some of these kinds of things, and that she had listened to me, and that she did care about what I had to say. And so unmet needs, again, go right down into the deeper relationships you have with each other. And we strengthen those relationships by allowing the other person to know what those unmet needs are. And that's a type of a reaching out and say, I'm sorry, I need you to, believe me. I need you to trust me. I need you to care about me. I need you to know that you think I'm okay, from her standpoint. And typically, to get to those unmet needs, first we have to identify them ourselves within us. And then we have to let the other person know what those unmet needs are. And that's the scariest part, is when we start doing those emotional reaching out to the other person to let them know what really is going on for us and what's really happening there, and sharing those vulnerable emotions and those unmet needs. And that's one of the best ways to begin to break that negative cycle. The negative cycle can't live in that environment.
I imagine that when you talk about your unmet needs and you can identify them uniquely for you and for your daughter, there's probably a lot of power to that. And I'm trying not to overly intellectualize things, and I do. And I just find that we did an earlier video on Dr. Dan Siegel's 4 things that we all need to foster healthy attachments in our children. And I find that if I'm having a hard time meeting or seeing what my unmet needs are, I can always come back to one of those 4 things. And it almost always fits for me. And they are being seen, feeling safe, feeling soothed, and feeling secure. So I think about with Tanner, an unmet need of mine is probably feeling safe. I want to know that he's safe. And probably for me, I want to know that I'm being seen for the effort I'm putting in to help keep him as healthy as I can. And actually, maybe all my needs are unmet. Feeling soothed, like that it comes when you know that your kids are doing okay.
Yeah.
I've heard it said, like, especially for a mom, but I think it's true for a dad. We're only as happy as our saddest child.
Yeah.
And so at times, for me, at times, some of my behaviors is trying to get that need met of wanting to feel soothed, reassure that, they're doing okay. So am I doing okay?
Those numbers are soothing to you. If the numbers are right, you're soothed when you call your son. Yeah.
Right.
And she kept saying, well, do the next thing. What's the next thing you need to do? So she soothed me by texting me the next day that she had made this phone call and that she was, working through this process,
Mm-hmm.
And it was soothing that she was, doing something to try to make this thing happen that needed to happen.
Yeah.
So I think what we wanted to, maybe the wrap up part here, not the wrap up, but the most important part actually, is the how to step out of the cycle. Do we have that as a slide, Troy? That's on the outline.
That is on the outline. I don't think it's go back up here to the outline.
Yeah, do the last half of the outline and it's a pretty darn good list, I think, that we're putting together there.
I'm going to take the outline out.
So we need to add that as a slide so that we can have a copy of that. And we can also do that as a handout that we'll get out to everybody too. But we can kind of talk through some of the things. We've already mentioned some of those things. The first thing is to see the other person versus just seeing yourself. And when
Mm-hmm.
you start to see where they're coming from, what is their emotion, what is there, and that's part of what this worksheet does, is it helps you to try to listen to in your mind what they might be thinking. And so the worksheet itself kind of helps to do that, but kind of
Right.
try to understand things from their point of view.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and I think you're so coming back to what you're giving a name to what you're saying, which is seeing the other and not just myself.
right,
So being able to see both sides of the cycle and not in a way that's blaming or accusatory, but truly understanding their side of the cycle.
right,
And then I think you're about to go into the second one, which is starting to see the cycle as the problem instead of the other person. You
right,
know, being unified. Like, hey, we want to both do this differently. And when we're stuck in this cycle, it's the cycle that creates the distance, not you. It's the cycle that creates the frustration, not you. It's the cycle that sounds criticizing or blaming, not me. And so stop seeing, like, attributing the negative outcomes of being in the cycle to each other or yourself, but attributing it to the cycle.
absolutely. And when you can work through this together with either your son or daughter or your partner, and you can both see how you contribute to the cycle, you can see who's the pursuer, who's the withdrawer, and what are your typical ways of operating. Then you can label it, and you can increase your awareness of it. And one of the things that's cool to watch with families is they'll get into the cycle, and all of a sudden, one or the other of the partners or people will say, "Wait, we're in the cycle." And they even call it a name, like some people call it the tornado, or there's different, names that you can give to. I gave mine the frustration polka. But as soon as you label it, then it's outside of you, and it's the cycle that's the problem, and not you that's the problem, or your child or your spouse or whoever that's the problem. And then that way you can really step out of it at that point in time.
Yeah. I had someone who was close to me who was working on naming the cycle, and they're having a hard time, but they recognized that this was a cycle that a grandparent had often done in the family. And
Oh.
so they were able to give the name of that cycle that grandparent's name. And it really helped them a lot because they could say, oh, there's uncle, or no, it was grandpa. And that really brought out, like, oh yeah, this is that cycle. It's not me.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And
Hmm.
then the next part of stepping out of the cycle, or another part of that, is to advocate for your personal needs, to recognize to be vulnerable, to talk about what you're feeling, to share these feelings, the vulnerable emotions, the unmet needs, and to be willing to advocate for your needs. And that requires vulnerability and risk, but it also deepens the relationship and makes it possible for those needs to be met. Because so often we expect someone to figure out what we need. Have you ever heard the dialogue between a husband and a wife where he says, "Why aren't you talking to me?" And she says, "If you don't know, then I'm not going to tell you. And you should already know because, we've been married for 25 years or whatever." And he's going, "I haven't a clue." And so it's like we sometimes expect each other to read our minds and figure out what it is that we need without us ever telling them. And it's just not fair. Don't expect them to remember your birthday or your anniversary. Tell them, don't forget my birthday. It's coming up in 2 weeks. Let me tell you what I want. And that's kind of a more superficial one. But to be able to let them know, I'm feeling really sad. I'm feeling really hurt today. And to be able to do good I feel statements, which is one thing that we practice a lot at Legacy and Juniper Canyon. I feel this way, and my part in it is this, and what I was hoping that you might notice would be, or do in order to help me in this, that we can change this dialogue.
Yeah. And then just being responsive. When your partner's advocating for those needs, saying, this is what I need, being able to understand it. Sue Johnson has an acronym. It's ARER. And the A is accessible. That's that vulnerability part. R is responsive, being able to respond in a way that that your partner who's being vulnerable in particular feels like that you were able to hold on to whatever it is that they gave them, even if it wasn't perfect. But to hold that with respect and love and compassion is part of being responsive. It's also changing the pattern, especially if you're the withdrawer in your pattern. You stepping out of that and showing up really communicates a lot to them about their underlying needs. And then E is engaged, accessible, responsive, and engaged.
I'm writing these down so we make sure we get them into our handout. And that was part of my next point too, is take responsibility for your own responses. Make amends, say I'm sorry. Recognize that, that you might have said something that was not appropriate or not helpful, but to be personally responsible. And I think that's part of being responsive, is hearing what they are saying, but at the same time recognizing that you need to take responsibility and make amends for some things that you did, and how you may have made this pattern keep going.
Yeah.
There's a couple of things too that come out of that. We're going to spend some time on our next session talking about the anatomy of peace, and some of the many of the principles in that book are the same things that we're talking about here. And so, like, just for those of you that have read it, it includes seeing people as people. It includes honoring the sense that when you feel like you need to do something that's a good thing to help another person, to have an outward mindset, honoring that instead of betraying that. And then on the influence pyramid, which we're going to talk about next week, and how that works. And then you've already talked about the other thing that we have here is one of the ways of stepping out of the cycle is the seen, safe, soothe, and secure, just to make your relationships a safe place. And then the last thing that we have on our list that, again, will be on the handout that we send out, is to change the goal. And maybe you could explain a little bit more about that, changing the behavior versus changing the process.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think I ended that in from another webinar that I was working on, which is about mindfulness. So being mindful, I think, really helps prepare us to be in the moment, seeing the cycle and stepping out of the cycle. But to change the goal means that being mindful is like, I think sometimes our goal is to be protective. And it may not even be a conscious goal. But going into a conversation with a different goal, like, I want to be aware of this. I want to see the other person. I want to understand them. And so instead of the goal of being understood, have the goal to seek to understand.
Yeah. And one thing about identifying the negative cycle is when you identify the negative cycle, and when you're in the middle of it and you notice it and you have the awareness to realize that you're in the cycle, you can almost instantaneously step out because you recognize the cycle. It's one of those, the awareness itself facilitates the change and the stepping out of it. And that mindfulness or awareness or understanding that that's where you are can change what's happening in that process. And that's the kind of magical part about this, is that the knowing it and knowing that you're doing it can help you to stop doing it or change it somehow. Mm-hmm. We're going to, kind of expand a little bit more on this on our next session. But this is kind of the basic stuff of knowing your negative cycle and being able to begin to change that. I don't know. Do you have anything else that you need to add into this, Troy?
No, I think this is what I want. This is what I wanted to accomplish, is that everyone leaves with a specific person or relationship where they can identify the typical pattern that they get into with that person. And now they're more prepared to have another conversation with that person, hearing their side and learning to step out of the cycle. And that's an experiential thing, something that you can do when you're on a conference call, in a family therapy session, or you just when you're interacting face to face. And if you can, I encourage you to do that.
Well, and one of the things I talked about in our clinical meeting with the other therapist yesterday, is that you have this worksheet for the parents identifying the negative cycle. I sent them identify the negative cycle from the standpoint of a young adult. And so a lot of the therapists are going to be using those handouts with their clients in the next couple of weeks. And my hope is that we can put those together. And it's hard for us to do telehealth with your client because they're out in the wilderness.
Mhm.
But by going back and forth with this information with your client calls with your therapist, and then working with your son or daughter, and to put these cycles together so that we can start to understand this even before you can actually talk to each other about it. You're doing the same work in two different places and putting that together.
I think that's one of the benefits of doing letters.
Yeah,
Imagine if some of our first letters were to each other about our attachment histories,
right.
things that they may not even know.
Yeah.
Letters about describing the pattern. Here's what I see. What do you see? And then letters trying to actively change the pattern. You don't need to avoid something. Like, you don't avoid, if you're trying to avoid a topic because of how it might be reacted to, I think that's a good indication there's something that needs to be addressed there. But can we do it in a way that changes the pattern, both us and for them?
Absolutely. So next week we'll do a little bit more on this in this kind of direction, and focusing on the anatomy of peace. If you haven't read that, read it. And it
And
will,
I appreciate everybody's diligence, their hard work, their willingness to push themselves in ways that they might normally not. This takes a lot of courage.
agreed. Thank you so much for participating.
Thank you, Maddie.
Thanks, Troy.